You thought you fired me, but I just acquired you. Those 7 words, spoken by a woman who had been publicly humiliated and dismissed as corporate decoration, would complete the most spectacular corporate takeover in business history. When Danielle Carter endured racist boardroom dismissals and systematic sabotage, nobody knew she secretly controlled millions through her hidden capital firm. What happens when her cruel firing at a product launch triggers a carefully orchestrated financial war that bleeds the company dry within days? How will an arrogant CEO react when leaked emails expose his toxic discrimination to the world, and he discovers the quiet maid he underestimated has been documenting everything while positioning herself to own his empire? This is the story of how grace became a weapon, silence became strategy, and one woman's patient brilliance transformed workplace cruelty into the ultimate lesson in power. Stay until the end to witness the moment justice arrives wearing a tailored suit.
We're not a charity, Danielle. Maybe stick to what you people know. Those 13 words, spoken in a boardroom overlooking downtown Atlanta, would trigger the most spectacular corporate takedown in tech history, proving that the most dangerous mistake you can make is underestimating someone whose power you never bothered to discover. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Pinnacle Tower buzzed with the kind of energy that comes with venture capital meetings and million-dollar decisions. Grant Whitmer's tech startup, Urban Pulse Technologies, had been riding high on promises of revolutionary social media algorithms and AI-driven community engagement platforms. The weekly executive meeting should have been routine. Progress reports, budget allocations, and strategic planning sessions that would shape the company's trajectory for the coming quarter. Danielle Carter sat at the polished mahogany table with the composed elegance of someone who belonged in boardrooms. Her long, straight hair framing a face that combined natural beauty with sharp intelligence. At 32, she had climbed the corporate ladder through a combination of brilliant strategic thinking and an almost supernatural ability to see market opportunities that others missed. Her black pantsuit was perfectly tailored, professional without being flashy, and her presence commanded the kind of quiet respect that comes from consistently delivering results. She had spent weeks preparing her presentation on the scalable urban outreach platform, an innovative approach that would connect underserved communities with technology resources while creating sustainable revenue streams. The market research was impeccable. The financial projections were conservative but promising, and the social impact potential was extraordinary. This wasn't just another corporate initiative. This was a blueprint for transforming how tech companies engaged with diverse communities across America. Grant Whitmer listened with the detached attention of someone who had already made his mind up before the presentation began. At 44, he carried himself with the particular brand of arrogance that comes from inheriting success rather than earning it, his perfectly styled hair and expensive watch serving as symbols of a world where connections mattered more than competence. He had built Urban Pulse on the backs of people like Danielle, while taking credit for innovations he could barely understand. When Danielle finished her presentation, the silence that followed should have been filled with intelligent questions and strategic discussion. Instead, Grant leaned back in his leather chair with a smirk that carried decades of entitlement and casual cruelty. "We're not a charity, Danielle. Maybe stick to what you people know." The phrase "you people" hung in the air like poison, its implications clear to everyone present. This wasn't just professional disagreement. This was dismissal based on race, wrapped in corporate language but delivered with the blunt force of someone who believed his position made him untouchable. Nervous laughter rippled around the table from executives who understood that their careers depended on reading Grant's moods correctly. Sarah Mitchell, the head of marketing, actually covered her mouth to hide a smile. James Rodriguez, the CFO, suddenly found his phone extremely interesting. These were people who would have to live with themselves after this moment. People who chose comfort over courage when it mattered most. But Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or demand explanations or storm out of the room like someone with less composure might have done. Instead, she looked directly into Grant's eyes with the calm confidence of someone who had survived much worse than boardroom bullies, and spoke 2 words that would echo through that company for months to come. "Noted," she said, softly, her voice carrying just enough steel to suggest that she had heard him perfectly and would remember every syllable. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined as they watched this exchange unfold, was that they had just witnessed the beginning of the end for Grant Whitmer's empire. They had laughed at the wrong woman, dismissed someone whose power extended far beyond their small world of quarterly reports and stock options. If you believe that respect should be earned through character and competence rather than demanded through intimidation, hit that like button right now. Share your thoughts on how we can build workplaces where talent is recognized regardless of who's presenting it. And subscribe to this channel because what happens next will prove that grace isn't weakness, and silence definitely isn't surrender.
Right at that moment, as Danielle's composed "noted" settled into the conference room silence, Grant Whitmore should have recognized the danger in her calm response. But arrogance has a way of making powerful people blind to the wars being declared right in front of them, and what followed would prove that systematic cruelty often disguises itself as corporate strategy. The retaliation began within 48 hours, executed with the surgical precision of someone who had perfected the art of professional assassination without leaving fingerprints. Danielle arrived at her office Monday morning to find an email marked "Urgent Restructuring" waiting in her inbox, the corporate equivalent of a pink slip delivered in bureaucratic language designed to sound reasonable while being utterly devastating. Her flagship project, the urban outreach platform that had taken months to develop, was reassigned to Marcus Thompson, a 26-year-old white Stanford graduate whose primary qualification seemed to be his ability to nod enthusiastically during Grant's rambling monologues about market disruption. The transition memo cited resource optimization and strategic realignment, the kind of meaningless corporate speak that made discrimination sound like sound business practice. But the cruelest cut came when her mentees were quietly transferred to other departments. Keisha Williams, a brilliant young data scientist fresh from Georgia Tech, and Miguel Santos, a coding prodigy who had been learning advanced algorithm development under Danielle's guidance, suddenly found themselves reporting to supervisors who had never shown interest in developing diverse talent. Watching their confused faces as they tried to understand why their mentor had apparently abandoned them was more painful than any professional demotion. The final humiliation arrived in the form of Derek Patterson's promotion announcement. Derek, a junior developer who had joined the company 6 months after Danielle, was suddenly elevated to Senior Vice President of Strategic Innovation, complete with the corner office that should have been hers and a salary that exceeded what she'd been earning despite her superior qualifications and track record. HR's involvement came as disguised as concern for her professional development. Jennifer Walsh, the head of human resources, scheduled what she called a growth counseling session, presenting Danielle with a development plan that read like a roadmap to nowhere. Despite performance metrics that consistently ranked her in the top 5% of all employees, despite client testimonials that praised her strategic vision, despite revenue numbers that spoke for themselves, she was being offered remedial training in cultural fit and collaborative communication.
But the most devastating blow came when Grant personally blocked her negotiated partnership with the HBCU Innovation Collective, a network of historically black colleges and universities that had been developing groundbreaking technology solutions. Danielle had spent months building relationships with presidents, deans, and student entrepreneurs, crafting a deal that would have brought both revenue and social impact to Urban Pulse. Grant killed it with a single dismissive comment during a board call. Too urban to scale properly. The phrase stung not just because of its obvious racial coding, but because it revealed how little Grant understood about market opportunities and demographic trends. The HBCU network represented billions in untapped innovation potential, but his narrow worldview couldn't see beyond his own prejudices. Through it all, Danielle maintained her professional composure while quietly documenting every email, every slight, every moment of discrimination with the methodical precision of someone building a case for something much larger than workplace justice. What Grant and his enablers didn't realize was that they weren't just attacking an employee, they were systematically dismantling someone whose influence extended far beyond their small corner of Atlanta's tech scene. Someone whose quiet documentation would soon become the foundation for their complete destruction.
No one expected what happened that evening, because sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones who've learned to hide their influence behind quiet smiles and understated elegance. What Danielle Carter revealed in that luxury lounge would expose the fatal mistake Grant Whitmore had made by underestimating someone whose true power extended far beyond any corporate hierarchy. The Meridian Lounge occupied the top floor of Atlanta's most exclusive business district, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city's glittering skyline. This wasn't the kind of place where corporate employees unwound after difficult days. This was where real power brokers gathered to make decisions that shaped industries and moved markets. The clientele included federal judges, Fortune 500 CEOs, and the kind of venture capitalists whose phone calls could make or break entire companies overnight. Danielle stepped through the frosted glass doors at precisely 8 p.m., but she looked nothing like the woman who had endured corporate humiliation just hours earlier. Gone was the professional but restrained wardrobe of someone trying to fit into someone else's vision of success. Instead, she wore a stunning black pantsuit that spoke of custom tailoring and understated luxury. Her long hair styled in a way that framed her face with confident elegance. This wasn't corporate Danielle. This was someone stepping fully into her own power. The transformation in how people responded to her presence was immediate and telling. The hostess didn't ask for reservations or membership credentials. She simply smiled with the warm recognition reserved for VIP guests and gestured toward the private dining area. Other patrons glanced up from their conversations with the subtle interest that successful people show when they recognize someone operating on their level. Madam Carter, always a pleasure. The voice belonged to Victoria Ashford, one of the most powerful black female investors in the Southeast, whose private equity firm had quietly funded some of the biggest success stories in tech and biotechnology. She rose from a corner table with the graceful authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of billionaires and power brokers. The greeting carried weight that extended far beyond polite acknowledgement. Madam Carter wasn't a courtesy title. It was recognition of status earned through results, respect built through years of strategic brilliance that had created wealth and opportunity for countless others. As they settled into plush leather chairs overlooking the city, Victoria leaned forward with the focused attention of someone discussing matters of genuine importance. "I heard about today's meeting. Grant really doesn't understand what he's dealing with, does he?" Danielle's smile was enigmatic, carrying just a hint of the satisfaction that comes from holding cards that others can't see. He thinks he fired an employee today. He has no idea what he actually did. That's when the truth that would change everything began to emerge. Danielle Carter hadn't just been playing corporate politics for the past few years. She had been building something far more substantial. Under her mother's maiden name, she had co-founded Meridian Capital Partners, a quiet but extraordinarily successful investment firm that controlled over $200 million in assets and wielded influence across multiple industries. She sipped her wine with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. She said, "Let's talk about acquisition." And those 4 words contained the promise of justice served with the precision that only comes from unlimited resources and strategic patience. Grant Whitmore had dismissed her as corporate decoration, but he was about to discover that he had just declared war on someone who owned the very battlefield they were fighting on.
But the tragedy had not stopped yet, because sometimes the universe orchestrates moments of perfect irony, where powerful people destroy themselves with their own cruelty. And what happened at Urban Pulse's product launch would become a masterclass in how arrogance can blind you to your own downfall. 3 weeks after that conversation in the Meridian Lounge, the Georgia World Congress Center buzzed with the electric energy that comes with major tech announcements and venture capital buzz. Urban Pulse's annual product launch had drawn hundreds of investors, journalists, and industry leaders, all eager to witness what Grant Whitmore promised would be a revolutionary breakthrough in community engagement technology. The stage was set for what should have been his greatest triumph. Instead, it would become the moment his empire began its spectacular collapse. Danielle sat in the audience, wearing a cream-colored blazer that spoke of quiet elegance, her presence calm and composed, despite knowing she was watching a man take credit for work that wasn't entirely his own. She had helped negotiate the partnership he was about to announce, had laid the groundwork for relationships that made the deal possible, but her contributions had been systematically erased from the official narrative. Grant stepped onto the stage with the swagger of someone who believed his own press releases, his expensive suit and practiced smile designed to project confidence and innovation. The presentation was polished, filled with buzzwords about disruptive technology and scalable solutions, but experienced investors in the audience could sense something hollow beneath the surface marketing speak. Today, Urban Pulse is proud to announce our groundbreaking partnership with the Southeast Innovation Network, Grant declared, gesturing toward a slide that displayed logos from major universities and tech incubators across the region. This collaboration will revolutionize how we connect communities with cutting-edge technology solutions, creating pathways for inclusive innovation that will transform the entire industry. The irony was breathtaking. This was essentially the same urban outreach platform that Danielle had presented months ago, the one Grant had dismissed as charity work that was too urban to scale properly. Now, repackaged with different branding and corporate messaging, it was being presented as his visionary leadership and strategic genius. That's when Danielle made a decision that would change everything. She didn't stand up dramatically or interrupt his presentation with accusations. Instead, she simply raised her hand with the calm confidence of someone asking for clarification during a routine business meeting. "Excuse me, Grant, but wasn't this partnership originally structured around the HBCU Innovation Collective that you said was too urban to scale properly? I'm just curious how the demographics and market analysis changed your strategic assessment." The silence that followed was deafening. Grant's perfectly practiced smile faltered as he realized that the woman he thought he had successfully marginalized was not only still present, but was calmly exposing the contradictions in his narrative. Every journalist in the room suddenly became very interested in their notepads, sensing a story developing in real time.
I think you may be confused about the specifics, Danielle. This partnership represents months of strategic planning and relationship building that you weren't involved in.
But Danielle wasn't finished. I see. So when you presented my market analysis to the board 3 months ago, were you planning to credit the original research? Or should I assume that was also part of your strategic planning process? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Grant's face flushed red as he realized that his attempt to maintain control was slipping away in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple news cameras. This was supposed to be his moment of triumph, but it was becoming a public interrogation about his leadership and integrity. That's when Grant Whitmore made the mistake that would define the rest of his career and destroy everything he had built. Instead of deflecting gracefully or acknowledging Danielle's contributions, he chose the nuclear option. "You know what?" he said, his voice rising to a level that made the entire auditorium uncomfortable. "You're done here. Take your little diversity project and get out. Security." The words echoed through the conference center with the force of a public execution. Camera flashes erupted as journalists captured the moment. Social media posts began flying across Twitter and LinkedIn, and the audience watched in stunned silence as a CEO publicly fired an employee during his own product launch. But Danielle didn't storm out in tears or anger. She didn't shout back or demand explanations. Instead, she stood up slowly, smoothed her blazer with deliberate care, and looked directly into Grant's eyes with the kind of calm that comes from someone who has just been handed exactly what they needed. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying just enough volume for the microphones to pick up. "This has been very illuminating." Then she walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the rhythmic precision of a countdown timer. Each step seemed to echo through the silent auditorium, and everyone present understood instinctively that they had just witnessed something far more significant than a routine corporate dispute. Grant stood on that stage breathing heavily, thinking he had just eliminated a problem. What he didn't realize was that he had just provided Danielle Carter with the perfect public justification for everything she was about to do to his company. The cameras kept rolling, the social media posts kept multiplying, and somewhere in the back of that auditorium, Victoria Ashford was already making phone calls that would ensure Grant Whitmore's actions had consequences he never saw coming. If you've ever watched someone destroy themselves with their own cruelty, if you believe that actions should have consequences regardless of who's delivering them, hit that like button right now. Tell us in the comments about a time when you witnessed justice served in an unexpected way, and subscribe to this channel, because what happens next will prove that sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply letting someone face the natural consequences of their own behavior.
Right at that moment, as Danielle's heels clicked their final countdown across the conference center marble, Grant Whitmore stood on that stage thinking he had just won a battle. But what he had actually done was hand a financial genius the perfect public justification for unleashing a corporate war machine that had been quietly positioning itself for exactly this opportunity. The collapse began within 72 hours, unfolding with the precision of a military operation executed by someone who understood that in business warfare, timing is everything and patience is a weapon more powerful than rage. Monday morning brought the first shockwave when Southeast Innovation Network announced they were reassessing their partnership commitments in light of recent leadership concerns. The press release was diplomatically worded, but industry insiders understood corporate speak well enough to know that Grant's public meltdown had cost him the deal that was supposed to be his company's salvation. The withdrawal wasn't just about lost revenue. It was about credibility. When a partnership that had been publicly announced with great fanfare suddenly evaporates, it sends signals to other investors and clients that something is fundamentally wrong with the company's leadership and decision-making processes. Within hours, Urban Pulse's stock price began a downward spiral that would only accelerate as more dominoes began to fall.
Tuesday brought the series of resignation letters that read like a coordinated exodus. Dr. Keisha Williams, the brilliant data scientist who had been transferred away from Danielle's mentorship, submitted her resignation with a brief note citing fundamental differences in company culture and values. Miguel Santos, the coding prodigy, followed suit within hours, accepting a position with a competitor that offered both better compensation and what he called an environment that values diverse perspectives. But these weren't just random departures. They were strategic losses that would cripple Urban Pulse's ability to deliver on its promises. Dr. Williams had been the lead architect on 3 major client projects, and her departure left gaping holes in the company's technical capabilities. Miguel had been developing proprietary algorithms that were essential to the urban engagement platform Grant had just tried to claim as his own vision. By Wednesday, the bleeding had spread to the client base. Morrison Financial Group, one of Urban Pulse's largest accounts, sent a terse email canceling their contract, effective immediately due to concerns about service delivery and company stability. 2 other major clients followed suit before the day was over, citing similar concerns about the company's ability to maintain professional standards and deliver consistent results. Grant spent those days in increasingly frantic damage control mode, making phone calls to investors and clients, trying to explain away the mass departures and contract cancellations as routine corporate restructuring and strategic resource optimization. But his explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears, and his growing desperation was becoming obvious to everyone who dealt with him. That's when the real devastation began to reveal itself. Hidden in the maze of corporate debt structures and financial obligations that most CEOs delegate to their CFOs was a ticking time bomb that had been carefully positioned months earlier. Meridian Capital Partners, operating through a network of subsidiary investment vehicles, had quietly purchased significant portions of Urban Pulse's outstanding debt obligations.
The genius of this strategy wasn't immediately obvious to someone like Grant, whose understanding of corporate finance rarely extended beyond quarterly profit margins and stock option valuations. But what it meant in practical terms was that Danielle's investment firm now controlled the pressure points that could squeeze Urban Pulse's cash flow until the company couldn't breathe. When vendors began demanding immediate payment for outstanding invoices, when lease obligations came due without the usual grace periods, when credit lines that had seemed secure suddenly required additional collateral, Grant finally began to understand that he wasn't just dealing with routine business challenges. He was under systematic financial siege. The most devastating blow came when the company's primary banking relationship was restructured due to what the bank diplomatically called changing risk assessments. In reality, Meridian Capital's influence in Atlanta's financial community had created a situation where Urban Pulse was suddenly seen as a toxic investment, a company whose leadership problems made it too risky for standard business relationships. By Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after Grant's public humiliation of Danielle, Urban Pulse was hemorrhaging money, talent, and credibility at a rate that made recovery seem impossible. The company's valuation had dropped by more than 60%. Major investors were demanding emergency board meetings, and industry publications were running stories about the spectacular self-destruction of what had once been considered one of Atlanta's most promising tech startups. But the most chilling realization for Grant came when he finally understood the true scope of what was happening to his company. This wasn't bad luck or market forces or even normal business competition. This was corporate warfare being waged by someone who had spent years building the financial infrastructure necessary to systematically dismantle his empire. As he sat in his corner office, surrounded by resignation letters and contract cancellations, staring out at the Atlanta skyline, where other companies continued to thrive while his crumbled,
Grant Whitmore finally began to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. He hadn't just fired an employee, he had declared war on someone who owned the very battlefield they were fighting on. The quiet woman with the elegant composure and understated intelligence wasn't just getting revenge, she was methodically destroying everything he had built using the same strategic brilliance he had been too blind to recognize when it was trying to help him succeed.
No one expected what happened next, because sometimes the most devastating blows come not from external attacks, but from the exposure of who someone really is when they think no one is watching. What emerged from Urban Pulse's internal communications would strip away Grant Whitmore's carefully crafted public image and reveal the toxic culture that had been festering beneath the surface of his tech empire. The leak began on a Tuesday morning when TechCrunch received an anonymous email containing what would become known as the Whitmore Files, a comprehensive collection of internal emails, Slack messages, and recorded conference calls that painted a horrifying picture of systematic discrimination and corporate toxicity. The metadata showed these communications had been carefully curated over months by someone with extensive access to the company's digital infrastructure, someone who understood exactly which messages would be most damaging when exposed to public scrutiny. The most explosive revelation came in the form of a private email thread between Grant and his inner circle, discussing Danielle's performance review from 6 months earlier. Despite metrics that consistently ranked her in the top 5% of all employees, despite client testimonials that praised her strategic vision, Grant's actual assessment was brutally different. "She's pretty, sure, but let's be real. She's just corporate decoration," Grant had written to Derek Patterson, the junior developer he had promoted over Danielle. "Good for diversity optics when the board gets nervous about inclusion numbers, but I'm not running a finishing school for ambitious minorities who think they deserve corner offices." The email thread continued with increasingly vile commentary that revealed not just Grant's personal racism, but his systematic approach to maintaining what he called cultural alignment within his company. He discussed strategies for managing expectations among diverse employees, for creating advancement opportunities that looked inclusive while ensuring that real power remained concentrated among people who understood the company's core values. But perhaps the most damaging revelation was a recorded conference call where Grant mocked Danielle's urban outreach proposal with language so crude and racially charged that major news outlets had to edit their coverage for broadcast standards. "Let her play with her little ghetto tech project," he had said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Keep her busy with diversity initiatives while the adults handle real business strategy." The public response was immediate and devastating. Within hours of the TechCrunch article going live, #UrbanPulseExposed was trending across social media platforms as users shared screenshots and audio clips of Grant's most offensive comments. The story was picked up by CNN, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal, turning what had been a regional business dispute into a national conversation about corporate discrimination and workplace culture. Stock prices plummeted as investors rushed to distance themselves from the growing scandal. Urban Pulse's board of directors called an emergency meeting, while public relations firms across Atlanta received frantic calls from Grant's representatives. But the damage was spreading faster than any crisis management team could contain.
The human cost became visible as current and former employees began sharing their own stories of discrimination and toxic workplace culture. Dr. Keisha Williams gave an interview to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution describing how she had been systematically excluded from leadership meetings despite her technical expertise. Miguel Santos posted a LinkedIn article detailing how his ideas had been dismissed until white colleagues presented identical proposals that were suddenly considered brilliant innovations. corporate clients began canceling contracts not just because of financial concerns, but because association with Urban Pulse had become a liability for their own brand reputations. Morrison Financial Group issued a statement emphasizing their commitment to partnering with organizations that share our values of inclusion and respect for all employees. Other clients followed with similar announcements, each one driving Urban Pulse's stock price lower. But the most chilling aspect of the leaked communications was how they revealed the systematic nature of Grant's discrimination. This wasn't just occasional crude comments or thoughtless remarks. It was evidence of a deliberate strategy to maintain power structures that benefited people like him while marginalizing talented employees who didn't fit his narrow definition of corporate culture. Major news outlets began running investigative pieces about the Urban Pulse culture, interviewing employment lawyers about potential legal implications and business ethics professors about the broader implications for corporate America. The company that had once been featured on magazine covers as a symbol of innovative Southern tech leadership was now becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked executive power and institutional racism. Through it all, Danielle Carter remained conspicuously silent. No interviews, no social media posts, no public statements responding to the coverage. Her silence became its own kind of power, letting Grant's own words destroy his reputation, while she remained above the fray, dignified and untouchable. The media began describing her silence as deafening, noting that the woman at the center of this controversy had chosen to let the evidence speak for itself, rather than engaging in public battles or vindictive commentary. This restraint only enhanced her reputation, while making Grant's behavior appear even more crude and unprofessional by comparison. As Urban Pulse's stock price entered freefall and the company faced potential federal investigations into discriminatory practices, Grant Whitmore finally understood that he wasn't just fighting a disgruntled former employee. He was facing someone who had systematically documented his failures as a leader and was now watching him destroy himself with his own recorded words.
Right at that moment, when Grant Whitmore's world was collapsing under the weight of his own documented cruelty, the universe delivered the final blow that would complete his transformation from tech mogul to cautionary tale. What happened in that emergency shareholders meeting would prove that sometimes justice arrives not with dramatic confrontations, but with the quiet satisfaction of watching someone face the natural consequences of their own actions. The conference room at Pinnacle Tower had hosted many dramatic moments over the years, but nothing quite like the emergency shareholders meeting called for Friday morning, just 2 weeks after the leaked emails had destroyed what remained of Urban Pulse's reputation. The same mahogany table where Grant had once dismissed Danielle's urban outreach platform now served as the site of his professional execution, surrounded by investors whose confidence had evaporated along with their returns. Grant sat at what had been his customary position at the head of the table, but his usual swagger had been replaced by the desperate energy of someone watching their life's work crumble in real time. His expensive suit couldn't hide the stress that had aged him years in just days, and his attempts to project confidence fell flat in a room full of people who had read his private emails and heard his recorded conversations. The board members filed in with the grim expressions of people attending a funeral, their faces reflecting the financial losses and reputational damage that Grant's leadership had cost them. These were serious business people who had invested millions based on their faith in his vision, only to discover that their CEO was not just incompetent, but actively toxic to the company's success. Then the door opened, and Danielle Carter walked in. But this wasn't the composed employee who had endured months of humiliation in silence. This was a woman stepping fully into her power, wearing a charcoal gray suit that spoke of boardroom authority, and carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who owned the room before she even spoke. She moved to the head of the table, Grant's former position, with the deliberate grace of someone claiming what had always rightfully been theirs. Grant's face went pale as the implications of her presence began to sink in. "What is she doing here?" he stammered, looking around the table for support that was no longer coming. Victoria Ashford, representing Meridian Capital Partners, answered with the kind of calm satisfaction that comes from executing a perfect strategic plan. "Miss Carter is here as the new majority shareholder of Urban Pulse Technologies. As of yesterday afternoon, Meridian Capital and its partners control 53% of outstanding shares." The silence that followed was deafening as Grant processed what he was hearing. The debt acquisition, the vendor pressure, the banking relationship changes, it had all been part of a carefully orchestrated takeover that had been months in the making. While he had been focused on maintaining his grip on day-to-day operations, Danielle had been systematically acquiring the financial infrastructure that actually controlled his company.
Danielle settled into the chair at the head of the table, her movements unhurried and deliberate. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had earned their position through competence rather than inheriting it through connections. "You thought you fired me, Grant," she said, her words carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. "But I just acquired you." The boardroom erupted as the full implications of the takeover became clear. Grant's supporters found themselves suddenly outnumbered as proxies were revealed and voting shares were tallied. The man who had built his empire on dismissing other people's contributions was watching that empire transfer to someone whose brilliance he had been too blind to recognize. Camera crews from major business networks had somehow gained access to the building, another sign that this wasn't a spontaneous development, but a carefully orchestrated public relations campaign designed to maximize the symbolic impact of Grant's downfall. The images of him being escorted from his own boardroom would become iconic representations of how corporate arrogance and discrimination could destroy even the most successful enterprises. But perhaps the most devastating moment came when Danielle addressed the remaining employees through the building's internal communications system. Her voice, calm and professional, reached every floor of the building that once was Grant's domain. Effective immediately, Urban Pulse will be restructured as an inclusive technology platform focused on innovation and community empowerment, she announced. "We will be honoring all employee contracts and reviewing promotion practices to ensure that advancement is based solely on merit and contribution. Anyone who has felt marginalized or undervalued in our previous culture will have the opportunity to contribute to building something better." Grant was escorted from the building he had once dominated, past employees who no longer bothered to pretend respect for someone whose true character had been exposed to the world. The cameras rolled as he walked through the lobby, capturing the final moments of a man who had confused power with worth and cruelty with strength. As the elevator doors closed on Grant Whitmore's career, Danielle Carter was already meeting with the engineering teams, discussing plans to rebuild Urban Pulse into the kind of company it could have been if its leadership had possessed the wisdom to recognize talent regardless of how it was packaged.
The quiet woman with the elegant composure had just executed the most spectacular corporate takeover in Atlanta's business history, proving that grace isn't weakness, silence isn't surrender, and sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply becoming everything your enemies were too small-minded to imagine.
Right at that moment, as Grant Whitmore's elevator descended to street level for the final time, Danielle Carter was already transforming his former empire into something he never could have imagined, proving that true leadership isn't about tearing people down, but about building something so powerful and inclusive that it changes entire industries forever. 1 year later, the auditorium at Spelman College buzzed with the electric energy that comes when brilliant minds gather to celebrate innovation and possibility. The annual Women in Tech Leadership Conference had drawn hundreds of students, entrepreneurs, and industry pioneers, but everyone knew this year's keynote speaker represented something extraordinary. A living example of how grace under fire and strategic brilliance could transform systematic oppression into systematic change. Danielle stepped onto the stage wearing a stunning royal blue dress that spoke of confidence earned rather than inherited, her presence commanding the kind of respectful attention that comes from genuine achievement rather than manufactured celebrity. The transformation of Urban Pulse into Meridian Innovation Labs had become a Harvard Business School case study in ethical leadership and inclusive corporate culture. But more importantly, it had become a beacon of hope for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in spaces where their talents were desperately needed. The numbers told part of the story. Meridian Innovation Labs had tripled its revenue while maintaining the highest employee satisfaction ratings in Atlanta's tech sector. The company had launched 12 successful startups founded by women and minority entrepreneurs, created over 3,000 jobs in underserved communities, and developed technology platforms that were revolutionizing how businesses approached inclusive innovation. But statistics, as impressive as they were, couldn't capture the human impact of what Danielle had built from the ashes of Grant's toxic empire. A year ago, Danielle began, her voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium. I sat in a boardroom and listened to someone tell me to stick to what you people know. He thought he was putting me in my place, defining my limitations, ensuring that I would never threaten his narrow vision of who deserved power and respect in corporate America. The audience leaned forward, recognizing this as more than just another success story. This was a masterclass in how to transform discrimination into determination, how to convert dismissal into decisive action. But here's what he didn't understand, Danielle continued, her smile carrying just a hint of the satisfaction that comes from proving doubters spectacularly wrong. When you underestimate someone systematically, when you dismiss their contributions and diminish their worth, you're not just hurting them, you're revealing your own limitations, your own inability to recognize excellence when it doesn't match your preconceived notions.
She gestured toward a massive screen that displayed the faces and stories of dozens of entrepreneurs whose businesses had been launched through Meridian's inclusive innovation platform. Young women who had revolutionized everything from biotechnology to sustainable agriculture. Minority-owned startups that were solving problems their previous employers had never even recognized. Brilliant minds that had been overlooked by traditional venture capital until Danielle's firm gave them the resources and respect they deserved. The world will try to shrink you, Danielle said, her voice growing stronger with each word, carrying the weight of experience and the promise of possibility. It will try to convince you that your perspective isn't valuable, that your contributions aren't essential, that your dreams are too ambitious for someone with your background or your circumstances. The auditorium was completely silent now. Hundreds of young women hanging on every word from someone who had not just survived systematic discrimination, but had transformed it into systematic change. "But I want you to remember something," Danielle continued, her voice rising to fill every corner of the space. "When they push you out, when they dismiss your ideas, when they try to limit your potential, smile anyway, build anyway, create anyway. And when they finally realize their mistake, when they understand that they underestimated someone whose vision was bigger than their prejudices, make sure you own the building." The standing ovation that followed was thunderous, but it represented more than appreciation for inspirational rhetoric. This was recognition from a room full of future leaders who understood that they were witnessing someone who had rewritten the rules of corporate America, who had proven that excellence combined with strategic patience could overcome even the most entrenched systems of discrimination. As Danielle left the stage, her final words echoing through the auditorium, she carried with her the knowledge that Grant Whitmore's cruel dismissal had inadvertently launched something far more powerful than he had ever built. His empire had been constructed on exclusion and maintained through intimidation. But her company was built on the revolutionary idea that brilliance comes in every form, that innovation thrives on inclusion, and that sustainable success requires leaders brave enough to recognize talent wherever it appears. They had dismissed her, disrespected her, and ultimately fired her. But she hadn't just survived. She had rewrote the future, proving that sometimes the greatest gift your enemies can give you is the opportunity to show the world exactly what they were too blind to see. The question that lingered in that auditorium and in boardrooms across America was simple but profound. Would you have fired her, or would you have been wise enough to follow her?
Here's the truth that Danielle Carter's story teaches us. In a world that still judges people by appearances rather than abilities, the most dangerous mistake you can make is underestimating someone whose power you never bothered to discover. I've spent years analyzing corporate takeovers and power shifts, and I can tell you that the most devastating ones aren't executed by loud, aggressive competitors. They're orchestrated by the quiet, brilliant people who were dismissed, overlooked, and systematically undervalued by leaders too arrogant to recognize excellence. Grant Whitmore's downfall wasn't caused by market forces or business competition. It was caused by his fundamental inability to see talent that didn't match his narrow worldview. He confused cruelty with leadership, discrimination with standards, and power with worth. But Danielle understood something that Grant never learned. True power isn't about keeping others down. It's about building something so extraordinary that your success becomes undeniable. The lesson here extends far beyond corporate America. Every day we encounter people whose brilliance is hidden beneath circumstances we don't immediately understand, whose potential is wrapped in packages that don't match our expectations. Danielle's story reminds us that the person you dismiss today might be the person who transforms your entire industry tomorrow, or the person who owns it. Her strategy wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. She didn't destroy Grant's company out of spite. She transformed it into what it could have been if its leadership had possessed the wisdom to recognize and nurture talent regardless of how it was presented. The difference between destruction and transformation is that one leaves ruins while the other creates opportunities for everyone who was previously excluded. What makes Danielle's victory so profound is that she didn't just win. She elevated everyone around her in the process. The employees who had been marginalized found their voices. The entrepreneurs who had been overlooked received funding. And the communities that had been ignored became the foundation for sustainable innovation. The most powerful moment in this story isn't when Grant was removed from his own boardroom.
It's when Danielle stood before those young women at Spelman College, proving that excellence combined with strategic patience can overcome any system designed to limit your potential. She transformed her pain into purpose, her dismissal into determination, and her silence into the most powerful statement of all. If this story changed how you see the people around you, if it reminded you to look deeper than job titles and first impressions, hit that like button right now. Share your own experiences with hidden talent or unexpected brilliance in the comments below. I read every story, and your insights help shape the content I create. And if you believe that everyone deserves to be recognized for their true capabilities, subscribe to this channel for more stories that will challenge your assumptions and inspire you to build bridges instead of walls. Because somewhere out there, another Danielle Carter is waiting for someone wise enough to see her potential before she's forced to prove it by acquiring everything you thought you owned.